Hello, welcome to the War Pod, the official podcast of the Remote Warfare Programme, a London-based research initiative focusing on remote warfare, the trend where states support local and regional forces on the front lines rather than deploying large numbers of their own troops. The Remote Warfare Programme is part of the Oxford Research Group, a peace and security think tank. I'm Alistair Mackay, Senior Editor at the Oxford Research Group, and in this episode I'll be joined by Christopher Kinsey and Helene Olsen from King's College London to discuss the use of private military and security contractors by states and their role in remote warfare. Enjoy the show. So hello, thank you both very much for joining us. I thought we could get the ball rolling with you introducing yourselves and your work on this subject area.
Well, I'll go first. My name is Christopher Kinsey. I'm a reader in international security and business, and I lecture in defence studies and international security in the Defence Studies Department, the School of Security Studies at King's College London. For the past 2 decades, my research has focused on the privatisation of security, and in particular, the privatisation of war, looking at the historical, moral, ethical and legal issues surrounding this particular area. And I've published extensively on the subject, including books, edited chapters in books and academic journals.
My name is Helene, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. My research focused on the relationship between mercenaries and legitimacy, and how mercenaries have been thought of as illegitimate fighters. More specifically, my research focused on how mercenaries have been practically objected to using specific speech acts, and how these speech acts and ways of describing mercenaries' legitimacy seem to transcend historical settings. So in this way, my research explores the tension between the extensive use of mercenaries in warfare and the apparent moral objection to their presence on and near the battlefield.
Excellent, thank you both. So the topic of discussion today, which is obviously hinted in the way you describe your biographies, is on private military, security contractors and remote warfare. And you recently published an article on EE International Relations, which I advise everybody to read, and the link is available in the podcast notes. It provides an excellent overview of this phenomenon that we call, I suppose, the privatization of security and its role in this practice we call remote warfare. One thing that's very salient about this subject matter is that there are an awful lot of terminologies flying around. So we have terms like mercenaries, we have terms like private military security contractors, we have contractors, we have corporate soldiers, private soldiers, etc. So I thought quite a good opening question, just so we're clear what we're talking about here. And it's an easy question to ask, but maybe not an easy one to answer, is what exactly do we mean when we talk about military and security contractors?
Maybe I can start. Military and security contractors, a lot of people actually do see them as mercenaries. I don't. They undertake security functions, they undertake military functions, and they undertake these functions for a range of organisations as well as individuals. Private military and security companies are legitimate businesses. This is quite different from the mercenaries of the 1960s, 1970s. So they undertake, they're a legitimate business, they undertake legitimate functions, and those functions are for primarily governments. They're basically service providers. Now, we've all heard of Serco, for instance, and Serco provide services to governments. Well, that's what these organisations do, but the services they provide are security related. They provide them in war zones, for instance, or high-risk zones. And the type of services they offer, and the three easiest ones to explain, is that they offer close protection. So if you're a journalist and you're going to go to Somalia to cover a story, you may require a security or what they call a close protection team to look after you, to make sure that you don't find yourself in a very difficult position where your life is threatened. So they provide close protection to government officials operating in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. They also provide static security to embassies, but also to other pieces of infrastructure. This aspect is actually quite new. And the other new aspect that emerged with the Iraq war was the provision of security for non-essential convoys. Those are the ones that the security contractors provide. Military contractors are more controversial, I would argue. Companies like Eben Barlow's Executive Outcomes, Wagner, again, these are legal entities, but they take on more traditional military roles, military training. And they also, of course, give direct support to their students, you might argue. So not only do they train them, they'll go into action with them. And the sort of training they provide is intelligence training, infantry training. And this has become more of an issue probably in the last 20 years than it had been previously. So those are the two types of organizations, private security companies, private military companies. What we also see is a crossover. Just because someone's working for a private security company doesn't mean they can't move across into the military game, and vice versa. And it's an issue maybe you want to pick up later in the discussion, because this does present problems, and certainly problems for governments. But those are really what they are at the end of the day.
I can elaborate on that point, if I may. So mercenaries, as both a concept and a label, is obviously very normative, and that often creates difficulties when we in academia use words such as PMSCs, PSCs, contractor, and so forth, because a lot of people have an association with the word mercenaries. For example, if you see a movie or read a book or watch a TV show, an easy way to identify whomever is supposed to be the enemy or the bad guys, you just call them mercenaries. And then people instantly have an image in their head of someone who is inappropriate or shouldn't be in the situation they are. So in that way, a lot of the problems we have in our specific topic or field of research is, how do we define the subject matter? Who is a mercenary? Who is a military contractor? Who is a security contractor? Chris, for example, have offered a way of distinguishing between these individuals, pointing at the different types of activity that they undertake. Peter Singer is another one who's tried to offer a way to distinguish these individuals based on how far or how close they are to the battlefield, what kind of activities do they undertake. I think a big part of the issue with trying to distinguish between contractors and mercenaries is that we have such a normative understanding and attachment to the concept and label mercenary.
Can I just carry on that point quickly? The issue is not that contractors are good and mercenaries are bad. It's the activity. Mercenaries can actually, and have in the past, performed good acts, and contractors have performed bad acts. We've seen that with Nice or Square. So it's not making that distinction. I think part of the problem today is people like the press. If you want to sell stories, then you use the word mercenary, because armed contractor isn't as sexy as mercenary. So when you see armed contractors protecting ambassadors, which they do, it's far better, if you want to sell your story, to say, well, mercenaries are actually protecting the American ambassador, which of course they were doing in, I should rephrase that, armed contractors were protecting the US ambassador in Libya when when they were caught and executed. So again, there is the word is often used by the press to sell news in that respect, and therefore I suppose people just catch on to that, and it becomes common usage, when in fact, they are quite different, depending on the activity.
Because one of the terms that's also used in this article concerns remote warfare, which is a sort of a shorthand for methods that states have used to outsource the burdens of warfare and essentially fight wars remotely. And PMSCs play quite a prominent role in that, although obviously with a lot of practice in remote warfare, it's not one that's heavily discussed. But you mentioned that there are a lot of activities going on there, and they kind of cross those lines between combat and non-combat. And it's actually quite a broad church of activities going on, not simply sort of ones that are in combat zones. It's also to do with all kinds of support roles. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the roles that PMSCs play in this practice of remote warfare by states.
Well, contractors themselves play a significant role in remote warfare today. Much of the high-tech equipment that is used by militaries is actually maintained by contractors. So if we're looking at drones, for instance, and drones are being used more and more, those drones are actually being not only maintained, but often being piloted by contractors, more so in the United States than let's say, in the UK. Intelligence, the intelligence field, again, we see more and more contractors participating in intelligence work than previously. So part of what's driving this, in my opinion, is the increased technologicalization of warfare. So as warfare is becoming far more technical, state militaries simply don't have the personnel to be able to keep up with those changes. And what's happening is manufacturers are basically using contractors to support their equipment when they sell this equipment. In fact, they don't sell equipment to the military nowadays. It's rather like a long-term 30-year rent, and they use contractors to maintain that equipment. But again, other fields, even medicine, Iraq, Afghanistan, they used contracted nurses. And again, part of this is the shortfall that the military have in manpower. So there is a whole array of tasks that are now being outsourced to the market. In the past, I would say 20 years, certainly from the Balkans onwards, than have not been done before. Well, had probably been done in history, but not in the last probably 100 years in that respect.
One thing that I'm quite taken aback by when looking at this subject is the sheer scale of it. And obviously numbers are sometimes a bit difficult to get an idea of on things like private militaries, how to describe them. But it is very much a billion-dollar industry, and it is also something that is making up a huge section of defense personnel. I think in 2011, there was some figures that came out that said that in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Balkans, about 50% of all DoD personnel working on those operations were private contractors, which is a humongous leap when you look at past wars from where it's about, I think, 10%, Sean McVeigh highlighted. So I suppose the question that comes naturally from the what is going on is the why is this happening? And you touch upon technology as being quite an important driver of that. But are there other sort of drivers behind why states would want to use private militaries besides technological advances?
So if you look at it in a historical perspective, it's quite like the same rationale as why states or private organizations use these actors. So you can talk about two different fields, right? It's either practical or political. And in history, mercenaries, or what we might today call private contractors, were used as a practical tool, a practical tactical tool. For example, as today, they were used when a state lacked forces, when the state lacked particular military techniques. We see with the Swiss pikemen, for example, they had excelled in a certain way of using weapons that were desired in other parts of Europe. A specific example is, for example, the use of German mercenaries by the British in the American Independence War. So in 1776, when Lord North was the prime minister, had to explain why Britain needed these German mercenaries, he basically said that they could be readier had than regular forces. So the British had a very concrete problem, which was that they did not have the regular forces to fight a war against the American colonists. So they needed the German mercenaries as what we today would call a force multiplier. And today, it's basically the same mechanism as we see, right? Mercenaries or private contractors improve organizational efficiency. And as Chris talked about, very practically, in the face of technological advancement, the use of contractors are a way of handling different technological obstacles. These contractors are specialized in using equipment, but also maintaining it and operating it. But also in logistics, these contractors are very important. But if we turn to the political side of the rationales for why these actors are used, we can sort of point towards various problems or rationales. For example, if you are a very risk-averse society, a society that do not necessarily want to engage in a foreign conflict or a particular war, you can use these actors to sort of participate in a conflict, but under the radar. This obviously creates problems in terms of transparency, accountability, especially in liberal democracies that hold these values high. We also see in literature different scholars describing the use of private contractors as a tool in foreign policy by proxy. So, for example, these contractors can be used in a faraway land as a way of executing a foreign policy that there is not popular support by. And finally, a lot of the arguments surrounding what we call outsourcing or privatization is financial. These actors are often cheaper because they do not require pension, they do not require health care as regular soldiers do. And with the rotation of regular soldiers, you can more easily put private contractors on the ground for longer periods of time.
Yeah. If I can just add to Helene's points, I mean, those are all very important reasons why we're contracting out more and more of these services. If we take Iraq as an example, for instance, it was estimated that if they hadn't used contractors, they would have had to have a general mobilization, and they would have probably had to have mobilized about 100,000, maybe 200,000, which would have been very, very unpopular with the American people. So the Bush administration decided to circumvent that political constraint. We'll use contractors. Now, you have to understand that when you deploy a soldier into theatre, you're bringing one out and you're getting one ready to move back in. So actually, for every soldier in theatre, there are another two soldiers. One's come out, one's ready to go in. With contractors, that doesn't happen. You deploy a contractor to theatre, and he may stay in that theatre for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I know contractors that have been in Iraq for 10, 15 years. So that in itself is a cost saving for the US military. It's also a political saving in the sense that they're risking a contractor rather than 3 soldiers. The other issue with Iraq, and it is an interesting one, as Western militaries have become more high-tech, they've reduced in size. So they're relying more on firepower, advanced weapon systems, than they are on large military forces. Well, the problem they had in Iraq was that they needed a large presence on the ground to subdue the insurgency. They didn't have that. And consequently, what we saw happen was an insurgency emerge. And the only way of actually dealing with that then was to employ a lot of contractors very quickly, which is what they did. The other reason, again, why they're I wouldn't say popular, but another reason why they do use them is the simple body bag syndrome, quite frankly. You know, soldiers come back in body bags, and that is a political nightmare for politicians. Contractors come back in body bags, No one actually sees it. I mean, you'll be surprised how many American contractors were brought back, in the cargo holds of commercial flights. Those scenes were hidden from the American public. However, every time a soldier came back, there would be a parade. So again, political constraints. That in one way, contractors are what I call a political convenient tool for governments to use. And we're seeing this more and more. And now the Russians themselves have realised this, and we've seen Wagner now being deployed. But they're not always that successful.
What are some of the problems associated with the use of PMSCs at the moment?
I mean, there are a lot of issues that still need to be addressed, both by governments and international organisations. The biggest one, from my perspective, is oversight and accountability, and in particular, oversight and accountability of armed contractors. We have seen both in Iraq and Afghanistan that they haven't always been held accountable for their actions. To say that they're getting away with murder, I would say, is actually the case in some circumstances. I believe some have got away with murder in this respect. So certainly there needs to be improved accountability and oversight of these particular actors. Transparency. The issue with a citizen soldier, if that's the term, if that's a suitable term, a state soldier, is that they can be held accountable for their actions, and those actions can be transparent, because you can always ask, well, you can tell, the generals have to account for their behaviour. That's not always the case with contractors. How do you make them transparent? Because the first thing they will say is, well, that's business in confidence. We can't tell you that because that will give the opportunity to our opposition. So again, transparency. And some of the other challenges, they can always refuse to actually perform the contract. They can hold you to hostage if you're not careful. I'm not sure this has actually happened, but there's the potential there. And then cost overruns. You become so reliant on them that then they can start to increase the cost. And what do you do about that? So again, those are some of the challenges, some of the problems of employing contractors.
It's interesting what Chris is mentioning about contractors holding their employer hostage, which is actually not a modern or a new worry. Even Machiavelli pointed to this sort of problem with using outside forces to help you in a war or a particular conflict. But I think it's quite interesting the words we use surrounding contractors, right? We say privatized, outsourced. These words sort of indicate that we believe that the capabilities that these private contractors undertake should not rest with them, right? That it should rest with the state. If you outsource something, that means that it originally belonged within the state. Now, this is both historically false, but also points towards a discussion I think should be had about whether or not we actually want to use these actors, right? So not only can we use contractors, but should we use contractors to undertake security and military functions in the future? And as we point towards in our book chapter, in order to make contractors work in the future and also in remote warfare, there needs to be a more conscious use of these fighters. This will both tackle the issue that Chris mentions in terms of democratic oversight, worries about control and lack of regulation, trying to tackle issues of transparency, but also very, very critical. How do we hold these actors accountable? Like Chris mentioned, most of us probably think of Police Hour Square in Blackwater when we think about terrible deeds done by these contractors. And one of the problems, besides the fact that 17 people lost their life, was that how do we hold these Blackwater employees accountable? They could not be tried under local Iraqi law. They could also not be tried in the US court-martialed. So how do we actually make sure that justice is served when these non-citizen soldiers act outside of the prevailing laws of war? Those are going to be the big challenges in the future with the use of contractors, in my opinion.
There's one other challenge that states have when they use these contractors, by the way, that they can inadvertently work against the state. And what I mean by this is that often once a military has subdued an insurgency, it de-escalates the violence. It's very important to de-escalate the level of violence. The problem when you employ contractors is that they may escalate violence because the last thing they want to do is to lose what they refer to as their principle. So their strategy may be to continue to maximize the use of force to send a signal to the local population that you don't interfere with us, otherwise, we will retaliate with all the force we've got. That actually can undermine a counterinsurgency strategy of trying to de-escalate violence. And the other problem, of course, is that often local insurgencies don't make a distinction between contractors and military personnel, and they attack both. So your contractor makes a mistake, and it's the military that end up being attacked. And again, for a counterinsurgency operation, that's extremely problematic for military commanders on the ground, that the contractor are creating problems for them that they can't stop the contractor, and they're faced with these problems they've got to resolve as a cause that the contractors have caused.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. I think one of the things that's also very salient about this is that with remote warfare, what people have said is that it has led to, in some extent, this kind of blurring between these lines of war and peace, and also these ideas of what is combat and non-combat, which is very problematic because it's a very popular form of engagement by states, if not the most popular one today. In terms of this idea of oversight, it obviously falls quite heavily on people understanding the difference between combat and non-combat operations and understanding the way actors are employed in those. In terms of PMSCs and how they're regulated, where do they actually fall in that kind of definition in terms of combat and non-combat? What sort of legal oversight is there of this practices that they're engaged in?
Well, maybe the Geneva Convention covers all combatants, non-combatants in this respect. Now, contractors that operate for governments, and these will include armed contractors, if they are given an ID card, then they come under the Geneva Convention and they are accorded the same rights as a soldier if they are caught. Those are prisoner POW rights, but they have to carry an ID card. Of course, in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, where they operate today, that's not the case. And certainly part of the problem is that the armed contractors in particular, yes, if they're caught, then it's very likely that they will be executed. And the reason for that is, and I doubt the people they're fighting or not fighting against, but the people, the Somalis, the warlords, not sure how to explain this, they're not going to make that distinction between armed contractor and mercenary. And certainly, I think we've seen that where when the armed contractors have been caught. In fact, there was a case in Iraq quite close to the start of the operation where British contractors were protecting a IT expert. He actually lived. They kept him, I think, for a number of years. The contractors were more or less shot quite quickly. As I said, notably because they wouldn't make that distinction. So international law, I think, needs to be developed in this field to make sure that there are mechanisms now that can hold this particular group of combatants or group of security contractors, I should say, not combatants, because they're not combatants, to account?
What's interesting, right? Because it goes back to like, how do you distinguish between a mercenary and a contractor? Right? There's very clear conventions against or measures to regulate the behavior and who is a mercenary, right? Article 47 of the Edition 47 Geneva Convention clearly states who is a mercenary and who is not. Right? But the problem with Article 47 is that it is very easy to be exempt from it. Someone once said, and I can't remember who this famous quote should be attributed to, but it's basically, if you cannot escape the definitions in Article 47, you should be shot and your lawyer with you. And that is because if you just incorporate a contractor into your force structure, they're not considered a mercenary based on Article 47 and a whole range of other things. So yes, I completely agree with Chris is that we need to have more targeted regulation in a legal, internationally legal framework to handle these individuals, because they straddle two different spheres, right? They're both a business, but they also undertake military functions, and we haven't really reckoned properly with how to deal with that internationally.
The quote, by the way, is a very good quote. It's by Geoffrey Best, who was an Oxford Don, and it's the one that everyone uses today. There's also a role here for states to play in implementing or introducing national regulation to hold their own citizens that participate in this function to account. Now, the Americans have already done that, so there are a number of legal instruments that they can use to hold American citizens to account. They will also hold foreign citizens to account if that person is working on an American contract. Other states have not, and I think that one of the reasons for this is that it's a very messy area, and even if you do come up with an instrument, trying to enforce that instrument is very problematic. I think the prosecution of the Nice Square contractors cost the American government, I think, more than $10 million in terms of the investigation. So that's a large amount of money. And I'm not sure states, I think personally, would rather brush this issue under the carpet and have nothing to do with it. Out of sight, out of mind, I think, is a term that comes to mind.
Thank you. That's very interesting. That's an awful lot of money as well. I didn't realize it was that high. But I think on this issue, one of the things that is important is the idea of democratic scrutiny of this. I mean, particularly in the UK, how much of an issue is the activity of private military contractors in Parliament? Do you think there is enough discussion of these engagements?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by issue, right? Because that way of talking about it inherently insinuates that you think it's a problem to use contractors, right? And that goes back to the question of whether or not military and security functions should be privatized or outsourced. I think a big problem is that the public, one, they do not know the full extent as to how the British and where the British are using contractors. That's one problem, right? That's a transparency problem. But there's also a problem in understanding what contractors actually do. You have contractors that guard embassies, you have contractors that cook, you have contractors that build bases, you have contractors that maintain specialized weapons equipment. But they are inherently, at least if they undertake military functions, a tactical tool. Right? So if you are to judge whether or not they have any sort of utility, you need to understand what role they play as a tactical tool in a wider strategy, both when they're on or near the battlefield. And I think there is an information gap there where the British public, for example, do not necessarily understand the type of roles these individuals undertake, and they are mostly just called broadly mercenaries by the press. So I think that there is a discrepancy between this area sort of normally be clouded in secrecy for good reason, right? Strategy making should not, as we say in the book chapter, should not necessarily be a public endeavor. But in order to better assess whether or not these actors should be used in the future, there needs to be more open debate and discussion and information about how and why and where these actors are used.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with Helena. I mean, she's exactly right. And in particular, I think the issue with the UK is an interesting one. We have a history of allowing our individuals to engage in, let's just say, mercenary operations in Africa, and that's documented. We've seen that. So I think when we talk about the privatization of security, the first thing that happens is that people talk about, Africa, the 1960s, Angola. There's that immediate link, but that link actually doesn't exist, because what these people are doing is something quite different to what the mercenaries of the 60s and 70s did. So there needs to be a more open discussion about what it is they do and why they're doing it. To give you an example, in the chapter in the book, it took me 2.5 years to get out of the Foreign Office the fact that they used contractors to help train the Lebanese police. Now, that training program was a legitimate training program. They were doing nothing wrong at all. And in fact, it was advertised, or it was actually put up on the company website. But I had to go to, it took me 2.5 years. I think there was a number of, tested it twice. Again, they refused. And in the end, the only reason I found out was because someone pointed me to that website. Now, I can't, they use this term while it's against the interest, the national interest or whatever, not to release that information. That just makes me very suspicious about what else is out there. And this is too much of a convenient tool. You're outsourcing military training, police training, and then at the same time, you're preventing us from knowing what is happening with this police training. Who are these people accountable to? So I think this whole debate needs to be opened up. And I think there needs to be more transparency. And if there can't be transparency in this field, then you do what you do with the intelligence community. You establish a committee that oversees these activities to ensure that nothing is being done that should not be done in that respect.
Excellent, thank you. I suppose the idea of debate is very important here, and the idea of, as you mentioned, transparency and accountability. However, it's also notable, as many people have pointed out, that PMSCs or contractors are certainly a global issue, and they've been used by states that are probably either quasi-democracies or they're more authoritarian regimes. So is there greater optimism more for democratic states that we can move towards this greater accountability and have information out there around working for? And is it actually possible on a global scale that there might be greater accountability and more fair, so that it provides regulation and transparency and accountability for less democratic states, particularly Russia, Iran, and those Gulf states as well?
Again, it's a very interesting question. If a state wants to engage in underhand activity, it will do that, full stop. Today, it's very difficult for a state to deny that their citizens are not engaged in war fighting. So what has Putin done about Wagner? He simply said they're nothing to do with us. But he can't say that they're not fighting. So plausible deniability in this sense is denying having anything to do with them. I think certainly they could possibly be used in the future in that context. And that is that states will turn to this particular tool to advance their interests by simply allowing their people, to depart and go and fight in these wars, and saying that actually, no. We all know, for instance, that nothing gets done as far as foreign policy is concerned without the Kremlin's permission. It's as simple as that. So while Putin can deny having any responsibility for them, I think it's pretty certain that actually, if they cross a line, they'll be in trouble with him. So they do as he tells them, or as the Kremlin tells them. I think this is something that may happen more and more in the future with particular states. And again, we're seeing this, I think, also in Yemen, where we see mercenaries, armed contractors engaged fighting. There is two sides to this. There is going to be, I think, this grey area where states could possibly use them for motives that maybe they shouldn't. And then there's this legitimate business side where actually they perform functions that are essential. For instance, the protection of assets in high-risk zones. And of course, people that work in this industry can move between these two areas. And again, that's another worry. How do you track these individuals? So I think both sides are set to grow in the future. To what extent is hard to gauge. The one thing I will say with the Chinese, actually, I feel that they probably won't engage too much in the armed contracting bit. The Chinese will certainly employ more security companies to protect their assets in Africa, South America. But I don't think the Chinese will necessarily go down the route that Russia has gone down, or even go down the route that we've gone down, to use armed contractors or to use military contractors to support their foreign policy objectives. I think their route is much more economic, buying influence, rather than trying to assert influence through the barrel of a gun in this respect. And the last point I will make here is that Wagner's not been particularly successful. It had an operation in Mozambique, which it pulled out in, I think, in the last few months, and a South African company moved in to take on that contract. It hasn't really been that successful in Syria. It certainly wasn't successful when it came up against US Special Forces, estimated to have lost about 200 to 300 contractors. It hasn't really been that successful in Libya either, in changing the status quo. Nor has it really made much of an impact in Venezuela, whether it was even intended to. And we've not heard much of it in the Congo. Wagner, as an operation, I think, is really there to look after Russian energy interests beyond Russia. So if you see oil fields, gas fields, mineral resources, and that Russia has an interest there, you'll not probably find Wagner there as well.
I think I would point towards two things. Firstly, liberal democratic states already use what you could call a secret tool in remote warfare, special forces, right? They are not necessarily celebrated when they died. They are not necessarily known about in the broader public, both in terms of why they're used and where they're used. And I think that needs to be acknowledged more, that even though Britain, for example, the US lead great wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're still partaking in secret operations around the world that does not necessarily include contractors, but what we would call citizen soldiers. The second thing I would point towards is what some people have called the market logic. There's always been this fear that bad people or bad states or bad corporations would use the ability to buy military and security functions and use them in a way that the rest of the world do not necessarily agree with. Right? But some people have pointed towards what they call a market logic, which is if a company engages with, let's say, a dictator somewhere in affairs that are less than acceptable and outside the Geneva Convention, it is very unlikely that that company would obtain a contract in the US, in Britain, etc. later on. So in this way, there is a sort of a self-policing for a lot of these companies. they tend to stay on the clean side of things, I would argue, because they are a business. They're interested in not just the current contract that they have, but also contracts in the future. Therefore, for them, it makes little sense to engage with a shady dictator one day and then the DoD the next day. You can obviously argue that then there might be companies who only specialized in taking contracts with less reputable employers. But I personally think that that is highly unlikely. I think it's more likely that, as we've seen with Russia and Wagner, that countries who have the ability will create or endorse companies to undertake their foreign policy interests abroad.
So that's very, very interesting. I think one of the things that becomes very salient when you look at this subject is that private militaries are very much going to be part of the landscape, the security landscape, for some time to come. And one of the things that you talk about in your article is this idea of there being quite a lot of opportunities for states moving forward, bearing in mind that there are a lot of considerations. But to end on a sort of more of a positive note, what are some of the opportunities that private militaries hold for states in terms of achieving security objectives?
Well, I mean, as Chris have mentioned, many militaries, including the British, are struggling to recruit manpower. And if you are a state that has certain foreign policy ambitions that you would like to play a role in spreading democracy or whatever it might be, that requires a military or capabilities of a certain size. Now, if you don't have that naturally in form of a stream of citizens who are willing to partake in the institution of the military, then you need to buy in that special knowledge, skills, and capabilities. So in this way, I think a lot of the possibilities as well as the challenges for the future in terms of using contractors, both in remote warfare, but also more openly, is having a conversation about how can these actors actually be used and what functions can they undertake. If there is a more open understanding of what they do and how they can be used, I believe that there will be less press and just general misconceptions about these actors being mercenaries, inherently bad people because they choose to fight for money and all these other things. Because the truth is, often these contractors are former military personnel who, for whatever reason, have stepped over or crossed the line into the private industry. So I believe that more openness and more information is really the way forward.
And I would totally agree with that. I think these are tactical actors. And we're talking about a group of individuals, often with a considerable amount of experience and knowledge. And there's no reason why we shouldn't actually utilize that experience, utilize that knowledge in places where it may be necessary. And the obvious example really is in helping developing countries to develop a police force, develop a military. These are tasks that are often given over to the military or the police, but they're overburdened. So why not use these ex-military personnel and again, police as well, to take on these functions? This is actually already happening. But while we have that suspicion, then it's going to be problematic. There is also an advantage here for African countries. Often they're having to rely on either you go to the Americans, you go to the French, you go to the British. Then for them, they lay down very strict criteria for deploying their staff to train them. And obviously this is rightly so because it's about human rights. But the market does offer these countries an alternative in this respect, the market. They can go to the market and hire in that experience to train their militaries. But again, as long as there is in place a mechanism that oversees that at the international level, to ensure that that countries aren't simply hiring in individuals to train their militaries in what used to be termed as the black art, that they're training them in normal military functions in that respect. But there are other areas probably where they can play a positive role. Again, because many of them are security experts, some of the organisations that are using them have started using the UN, for instance, and NGOs. And maybe this is a potential market. And certainly the UN that struggles with manpower resources, getting that manpower from states, maybe it can now look to the market. It already is for that manpower. So again, opportunities for other organisations. But I come back to this issue of oversight, accountability, transparency. That I think is critical to this industry, to make sure that we know what it is doing in this respect. So there are opportunities out there, and I'm sure those opportunities will be taken up in the future. What is key to this success is making sure we keep an eye on them. When I say we, I mean states.
And also the importance of critical scholarship engaging in this as well. And hence why a chapter on this is very, very important to get more clarity on what's happening. But thank you very much for dropping by. I think this has been a very, very interesting discussion. I think it provides a lot more clarity and information on the actual reality of what is going on with PMSCs, and particularly in this context of remote warfare. Before we go, is there anything either of you two want to add on this?
Not that I can think of right now. No, I'm fine.
I think I would emphasize that contractors are a strategic tool, contractors are a tactical tool that can be used in a wider strategy. Contractors cannot necessarily bring peace. They can be used as a tool in obtaining peace, right? But they are there to fulfill a contract, especially the ones that are undertaking military functions, secure an area, guard a certain building. They're tactical tools, and that is the key to understanding what they do and why they're used. You cannot expect contractors to mediate between two warring parties anywhere in the world. You cannot expect contractors to magically obtain peace. This is not what their function is. They're tactical tools.
Even Barlow discussed this many years ago, actually. Contractors are the same as any instrument of lethal force. They're there to hold the line, he said, while the politicians talk. Well, that's what armies do. They hold the line while politicians talk. But in this case, it's actually contractors. I think the most important issue is not the label, it's the activity, as far as I'm concerned. So my final point would be to say that contractors can deliver both good outcomes, but they can also deliver bad outcomes. They can do bad things. And I'd rather them focus on the good outcomes, the good activities, rather than the bad activities. But to achieve that, as I said, needs greater oversight than we have at present.
Excellent, thanks. Well, I think that's a very, very good point to finish on. Thanks to all our listeners for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as we did. For those who want to read in more depth about the topics we covered, we put links to any research or publications that we mentioned in the episode notes. If you want to stay up to date with the Remote Warfare Programme and Oxford Research Group's work, please subscribe to our newsletter by clicking on the button at the top of the page. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our handles are @RGinfo and @remote_warfare. You can listen to all previous episodes of our podcast free of charge by following the link at the top of the page. We look forward to you joining us soon.